I would like to welcome you all to our second Committee of Practice on Residential Property Markets. And I would like to declare the meeting or the COP opened. And before we start the program, I would request that the admin people just to project the program on the screen, please, if they can.
Sorry, Seth, I'll just do that right now.
Okay, now.
There, is it showing?
Coming, not yet.
Try again.
Still coming.
It's showing now.
Yes, it's showing.
It's showing you. It's showing to you, but the person who's sharing is not seeing anything. That is not good. Maybe my computer is feeling cold this morning. I'm looking at alternatives now.
We can see it, Seth. I think it's your side.
It's my side. Okay, fine. Okay, let me not waste time then, because I cannot see it from this side. Colleagues, just briefly, the purpose of this committee of practice sessions.
Seth, we've lost you.
Can someone call him and ask him to reconnect? Maybe it's network.
Okay, Kesia, would you mind calling him, and I will go ahead and talk through the purpose of the community of practice and the agenda. Welcome again, colleagues. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Alison Shangana, and I'm with the Center for Affordable Housing Finance. We have entered into a partnership with the City's Support Program at National Treasury, as well as with SALGA, to convene this community of practice on human settlements finance with the metros. Our first meeting was in November of last year in Cape Town, and this will be our second meeting in this new era of virtual engagements. So thank you for your patience with a little bit of the hiccups. But of course, the silver lining of this type of engagement is that it's a little bit easier to attend than to try to get permission to travel from higher ups within metros. So welcome to all of you. The purpose of the community of practice, as we envisioned it, was to provide a platform for metros to access some of the data around residential property markets, and unpack its implications for their spatial planning, housing development, municipal finance, and budget planning as well. So our objectives are to share the research that CAHF has around residential property markets and that analysis, so that we can provide an evidence base for the kinds of policies and plans that metros need to put into place. We also want to provide an IGR platform for engagement around the housing and finance framework. So this, of course, is an engagement that enables metros to speak to National Treasury. And of course, we have representatives from the National Department of Human Settlements as well with us today. We also want to enable peer learning between municipalities, between the metros. I think some of the most fruitful engagement I've ever seen has been metros speaking to each other about how they actually get things done on the ground. What works and what seems to not work, given the constraints that you operate with every day. We also want to look at how this information and reports can effectively be landed in the metros, so that you can own it and use it within IDPs, within human settlements chapters of the IDPs, within the SD-BIPs, within all sorts of other documents that you need to put together. There's some amazingly rich information that we'll be able to share today, and we want to make it accessible. So our agenda today, we were initially going to have a welcome by representative from SALGA, but that wasn't possible for this morning. So when Seth jumps back in, he'll rejoin the welcome. Right now you're listening to me. Our next step then will be some opening remarks from Molly Zhang, the DDG at National Treasury, who is here today as well. And then we'll have a series of 3 presentations. The first one is by my colleague, Kezia Rust, who is the director and founder of the Center for Affordable Housing Finance, which is the NGO where I am, up in Rosebank in Joburg. And we'll share some information on the residential property markets in the metros. It's new data. It takes us all the way to the end of 2019. The second presentation will be done by James from SALGA, and we're going to look at municipal rates and service charges, and specifically the impact of COVID-19 on these revenue vehicles, which obviously is a major area of concern. And the third presentation is from Anthea Stevens from CSP, who will speak to us about an analysis of the financial impact of COVID-19, specifically on metro water and sanitation. And then we'll close up by 12 o'clock. Okay, Steph, are you back on board? Sounds like the bottom of the ocean. Okay, can I suggest, Mali Zhang, can I perhaps hand over to you for opening remarks? Would that be all right?
Okay. Good morning, everyone.
The top of your head, Mali Zhang. There we go. There's your lovely.
Yeah, I will switch my camera off. My system gets to be a bit unstable. But good morning, everyone. And let me also extend a warm welcome in this court for all of you who are here in this workshop. So this is important, workshop for us. It is happening at a very. All right. So now, Steph is calling. I don't know why. Hello, Steph. I'm talking now. You can hear my voice. Oh. Okay.
No, we can hear you.
My voice.
No, we can hear you. Continue.
We can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So I'm saying that this workshop is very much welcomed from where we sit, because it is coming at a very unprecedented times that we are in. As you know, we have just tabled supplemental or adjustment budgets, which is about covered budget. I think what it really shows there is the kind of crisis that we are in, you know, in terms of the economy, in terms of the fiscus, in terms of the capacity to then respond effectively to COVID, both in terms of the health and both in terms of securing the livelihoods for people. So that is that attempt. So the economy projected to grow at about to contract by about 7.2%. So what COVID really has exposed is, in a way, the difficulties that a lot of the people that are living in our cities, in particular, in the townships, in the informal settlement, the difficult life that they are actually living. So it made it very, very, very visible. And it exposed, obviously, the failure of us as government to really have responded in the most effective way that we should have, given the kind of resources that we also have. It also exposed us in terms of the way we also deepened the special form in the way that we have built our cities. That still creates inequality and difficulty in terms of access. So the issues of inequality, poverty, and growing the economy are very much elevated. In fact, we are losing the gains that we had made. So this makes our city spaces very, very important in terms of recovery. But that recovery should actually be the recovery that will bring about more inclusion. So one could say perhaps we've covered, maybe it's a real wake-up call for all of us in government, in civil society broadly, because we do have to work together. So the issues of partnerships becomes quite critical, and I'm hoping that the broader government would appreciate that we cannot continue doing things and planning things for the people, without the communities. So hence the partnerships that we are having now with CAHF in terms of their specialization in looking at the property market, particularly the residential market, affordable market, and understanding the trends in them, becomes very important, because it is the information bank that is critical as the cities also plan their developments that will include inclusive housing developments, that will look at also how we finance this in a way that actually enable inclusion into the housing market, but also that enables people to really progress in the housing ladder, so that the house becomes a real asset, a real opportunity for wealth creation, opportunity for getting people step out of the poverty. So it becomes very, very important. So I consider this this process whereby the data is being made available and easily accessible by our cities, and the kind of analysis and the interpretation of that data also is being made available and easily accessible, so that evidence can inform the planning and that we can plan our settlements, our spaces in such a way that we are achieving the outcomes of spatial transformation, economic transformation that has eluded us for so many years. So I'm hoping that one of the benefits of COVID is a wake-up call for all of us, for our leadership, its commitment in terms of making sure that we really can deliver and deliver value for the people, and also for communities also to be working much more together with government. So we value this partnership with CAHF. We value the partnership that we have also with SALGA as a convening platform for a broader municipalities. Obviously here we have focused more on the metros, but the principles, we should be able to extend them beyond just the metros. So I think it becomes therefore important that in this platform that has been created for understanding the housing markets, housing developments, and therefore linked to housing finance, that you know, our cities really take advantage of this information, of this knowledge, because information remains useless until you turn it into the knowledge that you use, you know, to achieve what you need to achieve. In this case, better planning that will be much more inclusive. And I think the peer learning opportunities that this is providing is also my hope that our cities also can embrace that, because that is the only way that we can begin to take the steps forward in terms of really doing and undertaking investments and developments that really will bring about a change and transformation for people. So I am hopeful, although, you know, COVID has brought a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fears, you know, and a lot, but I think it's, you know, when they say in a crisis, it kinds of a way of taking you out of the automatic, you know, in the way that you've always done things, and maybe it disrupts you and get you into, you know, decisions that you will probably not be able to make, you know, in getting us out of the boxes that we have had in terms of how we operated, that has actually kept us where we are and not achieving the kind of development and impact even in the economy as we should have in terms of what we have spent. So I'm hopeful that beyond this, actually we will be better able to undertake developments that have got impact. And I think this opportunity that we are having now, I believe is an input in actually increasing much more creativity and innovation at our city spaces that will only transform the spaces to make a better life for all. So I thank you very much, and I hope that this session that also includes our assessment on the impact of COVID on water and sanitation, and where the issues of access in informal settlement and rural areas are very much glaring and challenging. That understanding those challenges also can help us take steps to actually address them in the most productive and effective way. So thank you very much, and I wish you an effective and good participation in this workshop and good learnings. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, DDG. I appreciate those welcoming remarks. Before we go any further, I just want to have a couple housekeeping points to keep us efficient and effective. The first is I need to let you know that we are recording the session, and we will make the presentations, the 3 presentations, available. We will email them after the session to everybody who's been invited. If you were passed the invitation by somebody else, perhaps also include your email address in the chat box. Which also brings me to the second point. Casey has already invited you to please everybody, each one of you, kindly in the chat box, just introduce yourself, give us your name, your position, and which organization or metro you're from. That would assist us, because a number of you sign in using code words or IT pool or an ID number, which doesn't let us know who you are. So thank you. We will also make these presentations available on CAHF's website next week. So they'll be available that way as well. Please kindly keep yourselves on mute while we're doing the presentations, so we don't have the background noise. It would also be helpful if you could rename yourself. If you go to your little window box, your name, and see the 3 dots in the upper right-hand corner and click on that, you'll see the option to rename. And you can put your own name and organization there, which assists everybody in this community of practice to understand who's in the room. We've chosen this format so that we can be aware of who else is here. and create that group. What we'll do is we'll allow time after each presentation for questions. You can either put your questions in the chat box, in the chat function, or raise your hand in the Zoom function at the bottom that allows you to raise your hand. Okay, so with those housekeeping things in order, I want to hand over to Kezia, who will take us to the first presentation to look at some of the title deeds data that we have on the residential property markets in the metros. It's very exciting. It's new data that we've just received. It takes us up to the end of 2019. So it really allows us to have an understanding of what's happening on the ground and some nice stuff that we can do crunching the numbers to see what's happening. Thanks, Kezia.
Thanks, Alison. Good morning, everybody. Lovely to be here with all of you. I'm going to screen share and then put my presentation on presentation mode so that we can go through this. I'm hoping that, is that visible now for everyone? Yeah?
Yeah, you can see Kezia. Thank you.
Okay, good, good. So many of you have seen the work that we've been doing in the past and have seen the CityMark program and the way in which we present deeds registry data. And that we produce reports, and those come out just about every year for the major metros. And then we also have a series of dashboards and some new ones that my colleague Alfred Namponya at CAHF updated and built and developed and put up on our website just 2 days ago. So we're excited to share those with you as well. The real thing is, well, why do we even, what does it mean? Pretty pictures or graphs, and what does it actually tell us about what we should be doing in our cities? So I'm going to take us through this and try and suggest a bit of an argument about how we use the data in the work that we do in the cities. Just first principles. You would have seen this. We divide South Africa's residential property market into bands. But this year we've added one more band to create a little bit more nuance. So in the country, there are about 6.6 million residential properties that are listed on the deeds registry. So those are formal. Informal settlements are not included in here. These are formal registered residential properties. We color the affordable market in the cool colors. So the entry market we have classified as properties that are worth less than 300,000 Rand. The affordable market is in blue, and that's between 300,000 and 600,000 Rand. I also call that the working class market. The conventional market is properties worth between 600,000 and 900,000 Rand. The high-end market between 900 and 1.2 million, and then the luxury market over 1.2 million. And that's the way we segment the market, just so we can get a sense of the distribution of properties across value bands and across the country. So in South Africa, we've got about 6.6 million, as I said. About 31% of those properties were financed by the state. And that's kind of, I think, a bit mind-boggling. A third of our property market was paid for by the state through the government subsidized housing program, and we identify those on the deeds registry using a proxy because they're not automatically flagged. But as at the end of 2019, we saw that was about 2 million properties. Now we know that there's a title deeds backlog in the country, and who knows how big that is. There's lots of debate around that and how many government subsidized houses have been delivered. Some of them are in areas where there aren't title deeds, possibly in rural areas. Others where there's a title deeds backlog in the metros. And if we had, let's say, 3.5 million government subsidized houses in the country, as we think we do, more or less, that would be 43% of our total residential property market, if all of those were actually on the deeds registry. When we look across the different metros, the distribution by value is different. So this is looking at the number of properties in each value band for each of the major metros. And you can see that you've got in Johannesburg has the lowest percentage of entry-level units that in its property market of the 8 metros. You've got Ekurhuleni with 34% of its property market targeted at the working class. Then you've got sorry, I've got a bit of a, let's see, get rid of that. There, yes. Okay, in Mangaung, 57% of properties are in the entry market, 14% in the working class. So you can begin to get a sense, and all of you from your particular cities and the perspective of your cities, if you have a sense of the income distribution of your population and where the need is, and try and think about whether this distribution of properties matches the distribution of households in your cities, and not so much. So that gives us a sense of the property distribution. On to the next, there we are. Okay, if we look at it, of course, different cities have different sizes. So Johannesburg has the most properties, followed by Cape Town, and then that's the distribution again by market value. And then a number I don't like, the average value of residential properties, because that's an average across a wide range of values. But it does give you a sense over time how property markets are appreciating and becoming more expensive, and that properties generally are most expensive in the city of Cape Town, less expensive Nelson Mandela Bay and Mangaung, and so on. This is a useful way to just position your city against the other cities. The thing that I always look at first when we get our new data, and we source it from Lightstone on the basis of indicators that we ask them to deliver us the data on. The data comes for the nation, for the provinces, and then for the major metros. And within the major metros, we get it all the way down to subplace level, which is neighborhood level. And the first thing I look at is the number of new residential transactions. That's a proxy for new delivery. So new residential transaction is when a property appears on the deeds registry for the first time. It wasn't there before. So you can see that between 2008 and the present, 2008 was just before the global financial crisis, and we had just over 70,000 units that were delivered in that year, and that fell dramatically by 2009, and then has slowly been recovering all the way through to this past year when there was a dip again. But if you look at the hot colors, so that's the red, the pink, and the orange, and look at how they're growing in proportion. And then the cool colors, the green and the blue, are coming down. Now that's the opposite direction of actually the structure of our population and the affordability of our population. And I'm particularly concerned with housing delivery for the working class. That's the blue segment, properties valued between 300,000 and 600,000 Rand. Last year, we only saw the new delivery of 9,500 of those across the entire country. That creates huge pressure within lower income communities as households are unable to access housing that they can afford. Government housing programs, though, do play a pretty substantial role in the delivery of new housing stock. And here what we've done is we've applied our proxy, where we've used basically the subsidy eligibility criteria and the design of the subsidy to look for what are likely to be government subsidized properties on the deeds registry. And then we've split that between, we've split the entire property market that's on the deeds registry between those that are government subsidized properties and those that are not. So as I said, it's about a third, and that is 2 million properties up here in this pie diagram at the top. And then over the years from 2008 to 2019, and interestingly in 2019, 38% of new residential transactions delivered in the country were specifically in the government subsidized property market. So the state continues to play a significant role in the delivery of new housing. Okay, looking at the private market, and what I've put up here, first of all, this is something I pulled off of the private property website yesterday, and I did a search for properties that are for sale in Savannah City. Savannah City is an integrated housing development. It's got RDP houses, it has FLISP market house, and then non-subsidized market houses, and it's in the south of Johannesburg. Largely developed, I believe, by Cosmopolitan Properties. And if you look at these properties that are available for sale, 420,000, 430, 460, 539, this is a new build property. I have here a table which shows household monthly income and interest rate, and I'll get to that later about why I've chosen it. A loan term of 20 years, the monthly premium that would then be paid if you choose a 25% household income on this income, 25% is this monthly premium. So then what is the loan amount that the borrower would qualify for? What's the FLISP that could be attached to that given our finance-linked individual subsidy program? And what's the ultimate housing affordability in the final column over here? So if we look here, this is the affordability of the first three houses between 400 and 460,000 Rand, involving a FLISP of between 58 and 64,000 Rand, which means that these houses would be affordable to households earning between 14,500 and 15,500 Rand per month. I've applied a 10% interest rate. It's a bit of an open question. Prime is sitting at the moment at 7.25. It's never been that low. I mean, for as long as I've been in South Africa for 28 years, and it's never been that low for as long as I've been in this country, at 7.25. More normal is about 10. And then the affordable market often pays a higher interest rate. So I've pitched it at between 10 and 12%, the interest rate, just for illustrative purposes. This last house, 539, would be affordable to someone earning about 19,000 Rand a month. If we have government subsidized delivery here up to 3,500 Rand, then this here, all of these households who would be eligible for credit, just take a look at the loan sizes that at 12% interest rate, these households might be able to qualify for. But because there isn't a property that's available to buy here, they can't use that to buy a new house. That's an important thing to understand, particularly in each of your cities. What is underlying the housing options that are available to your residents? Note here too, though, that on this website, Savannah City's been around for a while. They've got 330 houses available. Entry-level new builds are currently struggling to sell because of high levels of indebtedness and quite a small percentage of the population that can actually afford to buy those houses. So that's a challenge that cities are facing. So we've got this twin problem of declining delivery, and then we also know that in the context of COVID-19, there's going to be fewer resources for new delivery, whether that's from the public sector or the private sector. We see increasing pressure for working class housing, and this persistent pressure of informal settlements and density levels, which we've also talked a lot about in the context of COVID-19. And then I'm showing you these fancy maps that show, you know, the areas with high value properties and low value properties, and you can look at those and we can generate those for you, and they're available also on the website for different cities. Now, what do we do with the data to actually plan a response? And that's really what I wanted to take you through now. The first thing I think we need to do is really understand municipal asset bases from a property perspective. And here I'm looking at the national property pie again, but I've split each of the colors into properties that are non-government subsidy and properties that were subsidized by the state. So the lighter shades of each color is the government subsidized housing as it comprises each of those segments. So we've got government subsidized properties in the entry market, under 300. In the working class market, there's just under 500,000 government subsidized properties that are valued between 3 and 600,000 Rand. And then also actually in the conventional market, 75,000 properties we've identified in that segment. Now that's because probably over time, those properties have appreciated in value. If we look at it in terms of the specific municipalities, here I've built pies just of the government subsidized properties in Nelson Mandela Bay, eThekwini, and Johannesburg. And in those, just the government subsidized properties in those areas, the majority obviously is under 300,000 Rand, but there are significant numbers of properties in those cities that were paid for by the state that are now worth more than 300,000 Rand. And then if you think about which of those properties across those different pies are older than 8 years, because that's when a government subsidized property becomes part of the residential property market. 91% of properties in Nelson Mandela Bay, 96% in eThekwini, and 93% in Johannesburg of government subsidized properties are older than 8 years. And as government subsidized properties appreciate, they become a really important source of supply through the resale market for the working class. And so while the new build market is slow, and anything you do today will only be visible in a new house, 2, 3, 4 years from now, using the resale market might ease some of the pressures much more quickly. So we can look at the data also all the way down to neighborhood level. So on the left, I've got a table that shows the number of government subsidized properties as a proportion of each value band in eThekwini. And on the right, looking just at Umlazi, looking at the subplaces in Umlazi, we can then build a pie for the government subsidized properties in those neighborhoods and what's the value distribution. And you can see that there are some areas that are appreciating, and you can see a considerable number of blue, of the working class, but also some of the conventional market, the orange. And that's the government subsidized housing asset being put to work. It was built by the state for a particular price and over time is appreciated in value. And that value is now the asset of the household that lives in, that owns that house. So the first thing was understanding your asset base. The second thing is thinking about how do we leverage the resale market to support property market filtering. And here I want you to look at this graph, which shows, it's a bit to get to grips with. Each segment of the graph is a different market segment. So under 300,000, the affordable market, conventional high-end luxury. And then by year, between 2014 and 2019, we're splitting the transactions that appear on the deeds registry between those that are new, so that's new delivery, blue, and resale. And what's quite important is that when somebody sells a resale, when a property sells here, the person has equity and can move into this segment of the band. So the resale market becomes a really important source of supply for somebody who earns in that market. And if you can build, and our graphs and our dashboards, which I'll show you later, will give you this data for your city, you'll be able to see the distribution between new build and resale market build. And this is how it works. Some of you have seen this before, but I think it's really worth emphasizing. We're looking now at the city of Cape Town. If you have a household that's living in an informal settlement, and they have money that they can apply to buy this house, and this is a house that's for sale for 125,000 Rand in Delft. So they would sell their shack, let's say for 10,000 Rand, and they buy this 125,000 Rand house. To do that, they could actually get a mortgage if they weren't qualifying for a FLISP subsidy, and if they earn 550,000 Rand per month, 5,500 Rand per month, they could access a mortgage to buy this house 5,500 Rand per month. The banks are starting to look at this market quite directly. There is an official at First National Bank, at FNB, and his job is explicitly to lend to households who earn less than 10,000 Rand a month, to lend sustainably, but that's the focus of what they're doing. If that mortgage was over 10 years, it would be affordable to someone earning 7,100 per month. Or the person, let's say they were eligible for the FLISP, they could get the FLISP for 121,000, the maximum FLISP available, and buy that house. And that would be someone earning 3,500 Rand. What then happens that this person living in this house has 125,000 Rand of equity savings, which then they apply to the purchase of this house. That then, and I'm working on old interest rates here because I don't entirely know where interest rates are going, but it gives you a sense. If they brought their 125,000 Rand here, they have 155,000 Rand that they need a loan for, which would be affordable to someone earning 7.5 over 20 years or 9.5 over 10 years. And then this person with their 280,000 Rand of equity can go and buy this new build house for 399,000 Rand, which exists in Cape Town. Now, I want to emphasize two things. The first is that this is a form of de-densification. If there are people within informal settlements who are earning incomes that might make them ineligible for government subsidized housing, so the non-qualifiers who aren't able to access government subsidized housing, there may be some, we know that that's the case, that there are some that would be able to do this purchase if this house were available. So that becomes an option for de-densifying informal settlements by making sure that the people who have some level of affordability, but they're living in an informal settlement, can actually move into housing that they can afford. We've been doing some work about making those transactions healthier transactions. The second issue is that when you have someone moving with equity from this house into this house, it changes the math for the developer quite considerably. This 399,000 Rand house could have been bought by a household earning 19,000 Rand per month if at 13%, if they accessed a FLISP of 56,000 Rand. So it would be a 19,000 Rand earning household. But if they're coming with equity from the sale of their RDP house beforehand, if they have that equity of 280,000 Rand, it could be someone earning 6,100 Rand per month. So that means that the number of buyers that this developer can rely upon is so much more significant because they've got a wider array of people who will be competing for this unit. And that then means that you'll have greater supply because the developers can argue to the banks that there's greater demand for their housing. So then the third thing you do, and I'm almost finished now, is having understood the asset base and then looked at how to leverage the resale market. Those two things only actually work if we look to build value in low value resale market areas through the supporting of mortgage finance. And here what I've done is I've taken a screenshot from one of our dashboards, which is on our website, and just demonstrated levels of mortgage lending. These are distribution of resale transactions with a bond, and the colors relate to who the bondholders are. And you can scroll through all of the subplaces in the city to see which mortgage lenders and how many mortgage loans are offered in all of the settlements. But then what the city needs to do in order to support this kind of activity is to make sure that there are valid title deeds. And the title deed restoration program is a critical intervention and needs lots of attention. Clearance certificates, rates and services collections, making sure that those are strong and solid within local areas. Building approvals and building management, addressing the incidence of informal building and helping households regularize the building activity on their plots, and then good governance and service delivery. And that will make mortgage flow into these areas. So all of this data is available on our dashboards. And if you go, these are the hyperlinks to the different dashboards on our website. Please play with them. If you find glitches, please send us an email so we can fix them. There's a lot of material there and a lot of tools for cities to use as they become to understand their property markets, and then use that to define not only their housing delivery interventions, but also their residential servicing interventions, whether that relates to title deeds or water and sanitation or area management and so on. And I'll stop there. Thanks very much.
So much, Keisha. I liked it when you said that we encouraging the metros, to start taking interest, on this data and to play with it so that they can be able, to plan more properly and to plan more strategically with regard to, human settlements and just residential property markets, in their, metros. And that's basically what we want to achieve here at the end, that the metros start to be taking ownership of this data. And so thanks so much for that, thoughtful, presentation. We will now be moving to the next presentation, which will be done jointly by CAHF and SALGA, by Alison and James.
Sorry, Seth, I think there was one question in the chat box.
I thought the question was going to be
Keisha
entertained after. Sorry?
There was one question in the chat box that perhaps Keisha could just speak to before we move on to the next presentation.
Okay, no, that's fine.
I can respond to that. Yes, I'm very happy to. You're asking the question, am I assuming through this process of moving up the housing property ladder that the total loan to purchase the house, basically that the household who has sold their house can use all of that as the deposit into the next house? In this example, I actually am, because the thing about government subsidized houses is that they are given away for free. And so the household who is living in a government subsidized house, that's entire equity. It hardly exists in any of the other residential property markets, but those houses are full equity houses. And so that full price can be paid to buy as a deposit into the next house. So in that context, I am. Once somebody is selling a house that they had a bond on and then they move to the next one, then yeah, it's just the equity portion that they can apply. But in this example, because we're working, that ladder was with government subsidized properties, all of those are entirely equity. The whole of the house is equity. And that's actually what is so hugely powerful about this bottom rung of the property market.
Other question on the chat? Nothing.
Is there another question? I don't see any other questions.
Okay, fine. Then I would propose that we move to the next presentation, whose topic is potential impact of COVID-19 on municipal rates and service charges, including an analysis of residential exclusion threshold using the DEED's data. Alison and James, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Prasef. Alison, should I project or how should we do it?
I can project and you can just tell me when to go to the next slide.
Please.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone.
It's Mara talking. May I just make a quick intervention? Seth? Sorry, I was a bit slow to raise my hand earlier.
Okay, fine. I can entertain that.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to make a comment, which was to say that...
why don't you just draft something and then we can build on it.
Okay. I just wanted to make a comment about the presentation. So I think it's really exciting to see this new data. So thanks, Casey and CAHF. I think it's really interesting. My point, probably unsurprisingly, is just to put into the framework for the discussion in this community of practice the fact that 60% of South Africa, of people holding land and dwellings in South Africa, are outside of the registered property system. So the reason that I'm raising that is just to keep in perspective the meaning of this data, because of the extent of exclusion from registered property for most. We think that that 60% is probably a conservative percentage. And I think it's really important, Casey did make this point, that when you're looking at segmentation by value, that there is some reference to income distribution as well. Because otherwise what we're not seeing is, firstly, we're not analyzing any data of that 60%. And secondly, we're not seeing how this matches with income distribution in the country. And of course, it doesn't match very well with income distribution. So I think another way of thinking about it might be that in as much as Casey was using the word working class, we also need to look at that other descriptor of households, which is the precariat, which really falls well outside of the conversation that we're having today. So I think that from a public sector point of view and from a metro point of view, it becomes a question of where to put your balance of effort. So it might be on title deed restoration, it might be on the resale market, but in my view, it should be on reforming the land administration system so that the 60% of land and dwelling holding outside of the system can be recognized, and then we can start talking about narrowing the inequality gap. Thanks.
Keisha, would you like to comment on this point?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the what Lauren is saying is absolutely correct, that there is a backlog of properties that are either not titled, or where the title doesn't well reflect the relationship to that land that exists in real life. We've done lots of work in looking at that in urban areas. And that's the work of the Transaction Support Center. And within that, looking at ways in which the land administration process can better suit urban residents who have compromised title situations. And that's definitely an area to look at. But I actually think that that goes hand in hand. The reason you do that is that so you can create the asset value, or realize the asset value for those households, so that they can participate in the property market and realize the value that was conferred on them through the state's program. Thanks.
Okay. Colleagues, we're supposed to start now the next presentation. It's 11 o'clock. We will be noting the questions that are coming through the chat. And so immediately after this presentation, we'll also allow some responses to your questions. You can now proceed, James.
Thanks, Prasef. Alison, if you could just move to that slide with a picture on it. And again, good morning to everyone, and thank you for making time for this session. My part of the presentation is going to be very brief because when we were planning for this specific COP, our key interest from SALGA was around what kind of impact COVID-19 would have on property rates, so that we can sort of like juxtapose the discussions around property markets and the impact of the pandemic on property rates. And as you can see there on the first slide, that the newspaper headline on the 13th of May about the challenges that municipalities have been encountering around their decisions not to provide some of the rebates and some of the payment holidays for rates due to COVID-19. There was a lot of that was coming out in the sector, though we were aware that there are certain municipalities that have considered giving their residents rebates and payment holidays, like I think it's Stellenbosch that did that. I know that Kwatu Guza also had some economic programs that are available where business people can receive rebates based on coming back into business as and when business opens through all the levels. You can go to the next slide. What we want to also indicate is that one thing that this COVID-19 pandemic has done is that it has placed municipal property rates on the spotlight. Whereas before you would get a situation where each municipality would have its resident associations challenging the rates. Now there's been this almost global questioning of rates. There are complaints around rates increases that are beyond inflation. I had already mentioned that there's a request for a consideration of the economic and COVID-19 hardships and rethinking rates. And then of course there are advocacy groups that are looking for a better rethink of Section 15 on exemptions, reductions and rebates. We had a media inquiry from a very well-established media house recently where they were also asking for this information, basically us putting SALGA on the spot to provide our position around what we think about municipalities being in a position to provide rebates and payment holidays. And again, the most important aspect with this would be for a municipality to consider its financial viability first and whether they can afford that, and also their ability to apply their fiscal discipline and their ability to be able to collect. That definitely would be important for municipalities to consider. But what we are seeing now is that more and more, there is a question of how municipalities are implementing their property rates. We also came across this advertisement recently that talks to research that needs to be done around rates. And one thing for sure that the outcomes of this study might lead to more challenges coming to municipalities around how they develop their property rates, and ultimately what kind of consideration do they apply when the economic climate changes, what kind of consideration do they apply when there's a pandemic of this sort. Go to the next slide. Now, I try to avoid numbers as far as possible with this presentation, and already I could see that with the DDG of National Treasury indicating that the contraction is projected to be 7.2. And in my preparation of the presentation, I used data from a month ago. So that's some of the challenges that we have during this period, that the availability of information is so slow that you end up having the credibility of what you're presenting being questioned. But fortunately for me, it's conservative to what National Treasury just presented, and it's not far from 7.2. But yes, indeed, the macroeconomic projection is projected to decline, and the country's in a recession. What does that basically mean for municipalities, and more specifically around your indigent households, who will be the ones that are most affected by the lockdown regulations that were implemented, the fact that all informal workers could not necessarily earn an income, and the fact that there is a projection that at least 26% of the households of the workforce was not able to earn any income during the lockdown. That definitely had an impact on municipalities' ability to collect. And the next point there, of course, being around your indigent services. And again, with the 15%, we are saying that 15% is across the board. It's not for specific municipalities. It differs municipality by municipality. But ultimately, the point being made that some of the delays in intergovernmental transfers will definitely result in liquidity challenges, and ultimately municipalities not being able to pay things like their salaries, etc., etc. And then, of course, the next point there being around the fact that when the regulations were passed by the Minister of COPTA, there was also emphasis during the lockdown for municipalities to not to implement their credit control practices entirely, because some of the services that were identified to respond to COVID-19 were linked to municipal services as well. Just go to the next slide, Alison. And just to touch, colleagues, on the liquidity aspect as well, I think what is key here is for a clear understanding that a municipal financial position before lockdown will definitely determine how well it fares during this crisis. And looking at what Moody's shares with us there in terms of what is possible across all the municipalities that they are rating, an indication that City of Cape Town will fare better because they had better liquidity projections, and some of the municipalities that don't have that excellent liquidity projections will definitely suffer during this period due to the fact that it means that they are not in the right position to respond to anything that is uncertain, like a crisis and a pandemic as well. Next slide. And then the next slide here talks to, again, the fact that with revenue declining, municipalities will definitely need to revise their bad debt provisions. One point that was made is that the term of council that will be starting next year will be grappling with the impact of COVID-19 for the duration of the 5 years of that term. So ultimately, municipalities need to consider the impact the loss of revenue will have on their ability to collect, and also an understanding that with the sector already encountering very, very high debtors in as far as amounts that are outstanding, these amounts are bound to move up as well. And also looking at the AG's announcements yesterday and the fact that municipalities are unable to collect the majority of the amounts that they are billing already. So with this crisis, what does that mean for the sector? And with that, I will be handing over to Alison to talk on the numbers. Like I had indicated, colleagues, that I will try my level best to avoid talking to numbers here because the numbers shift and change so rapidly. But there were some funds that municipalities expected from this COVID-19 pandemic relief, specifically the 20 billion relief fund. Municipalities had a lot of expectations around this, but we can safely indicate that National Treasury has stuck to its principles with this fund, because when you look at the 20 billion fund, it does not respond as a bailout like municipalities had expected due to loss of revenue. Rather, this 20 billion fund will be responding directly to all the functions that are linked to COVID-19 in order to help municipalities to perform and to provide services better. And with that, I will be handing over to Alison, who I saw will be talking to the numbers as well. So yeah, good luck with that, Alison. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, James. Okay, oops. There we go. I'm going to unpack a little bit more the impact of the epidemic on property rates revenue. So just as a framing, as most of us are aware, municipalities depend largely on own revenue as opposed to provincial government. And rates are a significant part of own revenue for municipalities. So property rates account for between 14 and 16% of municipal own revenue. And service charges are about 50%, and transfer is about 22%. That's the average across all 250 odd municipalities. And it obviously varies depending on metros, the financial health of the municipality, the rate, et cetera. So for instance, the Kurleni in their draft budget for March indicated that property rates would be about 15% of own revenue and service charges around 60%, transfers around 11%. So on the whole, metros are much less dependent on transfers and more dependent on rates revenue and service revenue. We've seen between 2013 and 2017-18 that property rates are growing around 9% a year, so over inflation, which is important to note. However, in the supplementary budget review, the new budget that came out last week, it was reported that metros are saying that their revenue in April fell by 30% on average. So that's some of the numbers that James didn't want to say. But essentially, we're seeing that large drop largely because of a lower demand for services, electricity and water. For instance, restaurants not using either because they're not open, and significantly higher non-payment rates for municipal bills because of the lockdown and the impact on the economy. So whether those collection rates improve is going to depend on the duration of restrictions, how quickly we open up the economy, the pace of the economic recovery, not just releasing those regulations, but how quickly businesses and households can bounce back, and also the degree to which metros and municipalities apply their revenue collection measures. How stringent are they? Or how flexible and relaxed are they around it? So it's difficult to estimate the impact on rates revenue collection. We may see in the revised budget some downward revisions, but it doesn't appear. I did an analysis of the budgets that were available online for the 8 metros over the last week, and I haven't seen significant changes in the rates policies compared to the budgets from March. So as Melejang, I think, mentioned right at the beginning of our session, National Treasury, given the unusual situation we're in this year, is allowing municipalities to entirely redo their 2020 budgets. So most of them produced draft budgets in March or April, and of course needed to approve them by the beginning of the financial year, the 1st of July. However, they have been permitted to do new budgets to take into account the epidemic and the national disaster and the lockdown. I think what we want to delve into a little bit more in this presentation is one of the elements of the property rates policy, which is the residential exclusion threshold. And I think that has shown to be one of the more efficient means of providing relief to poor households through the rates policies. But it's not the only vehicle. As James mentioned, municipalities also have the authority to use reductions and exemptions through Section 15 of the Municipal Property Rates Act. A number of them already do that. So you see relief to pensioners, relief to people with disabilities, obviously various packages for those who are on the register. But it's important to note that the Act also allows municipalities to identify particular categories of property owners. Sorry, I'm sending my child away. So the MPRA allows metros to identify particular categories of property owners, and some of them that are allowed would be those who are temporarily without income, those who are affected by a disaster, or those with residential properties with a market value that's lower than an amount determined by the municipality. Now, these are clauses in the Act that are often not used by municipalities, but they are available. And so with some creativity, it's possible to engineer and innovate relief measures in the rates policies this year that look different than previous years for obvious reasons. So if we look with more detail at the residential exclusion threshold. The residential exclusion threshold, just to remind ourselves, is in Section 17 of the Act, and it basically is a minimum. According to the national legislation, all municipalities need to say in their rates policies that below a house that is valued below 15,000 Rand, no municipalities can levy any rates upon. However, the MPRA also says that municipalities can create their own rates policies, so if they want to make that threshold higher than 15,000, they have the authority to do so. Now that 15,000 amount, that minimum threshold, was stipulated in the MPRA Act when it was passed years ago. And at the time, it was set to match the value of the subsidy, the housing subsidy, set in March 1994. However, subsequently, the subsidy amount has grown, and the specifications and standards for an RDP house, an IRDP house, have grown, and now are sitting at around 116,000 if we exclude services. So the minimum threshold, that 15,000, has not kept pace with the value of the housing subsidy. In other words, with the input costs associated with an RDP house. Now, it's noted that the MPRA Act was amended in 2009, but one of the changes was not the 15,000 threshold. So the decision was taken not to amend that. And although I'm not entirely up on that discussion, I would suspect that the concern would have been that national government would have been expected to cover the shortfall, the revenue foregone by municipalities, if that threshold was increased. It's probably the reason it was not increased. So since then, what have we seen with the residential exclusion threshold? Have municipalities kept it at 15,000? Has it increased? When we look at the most recent budgets for 2020-21, we see that 2 metros have kept it at 15,000. And those are the Eastern Cape metros of Nelson Mandela and Buffalo City. Now, others have increased it over time and have much more generous policies. So Joburg is the highest threshold at 350,000. Cape Town is at 300,000. You can see eThekwini is at 230,000. Ekurhuleni and Tshwane are at 150, and Mangaung recently increased it to 80,000. So what impact does that have? Well, we would assume that one of the first policy intentions would be to make sure that if you receive an RDP house, if you're a beneficiary, and you receive it because your income is below a certain threshold and you can't pay for housing yourself, that you wouldn't then the next day be levied rates. So what we wanted to do firstly was to look at the exclusion threshold and compare it to the average value of a government subsidized house. So if you're an average beneficiary sitting in a government subsidized house, are you being levied rates? And what we found is that in 6 of the 8 metros, the residential exclusion threshold is well below the average value of a government subsidized property. In other words, most beneficiaries who've received a house from government are levied rates by the metro. That's in 6 of the 8 metros. However, in Cape Town and in Joburg, because the residential exclusion threshold is higher, it exceeds the average value of a government subsidized house. So beneficiaries then are not liable for a rates bill. But what this also means, importantly, in terms of equity, is that a variation in the exclusion threshold means that some government housing beneficiaries will be exempt, while others will be immediately liable for rates, depending on where they live. So let's take the example of Cape Town. This is the split of the market segments of the residential properties in Cape Town for 2019. This is the data Kesia was showing you. And now keeping in mind that the exclusion threshold for Cape Town is at 300,000 for 2020-21, which means that 19% of all residential properties fall below the exclusion threshold. 19% of houses are not levied rates because of that element of the rates policy in Cape Town. Looking a little bit more specifically at government subsidized housing only. So nearly 25% of residential properties in Cape Town are government subsidized housing. And of all of those, about 65% fall under the exclusion threshold. So about 65% of occupants or owners of government subsidized houses are not levied rates within Cape Town. However, that also means that 35% are. So if we look at the impact of the exclusion threshold on owners of government subsidized houses, what we've done here is we've taken account of the 8-year restriction on the sale of an RDP property. And what we've done is we've charted here the average value of an RDP property that is less than 8 years old in the blue and more than 8 years old in the orange for each metro. So you can see that in eThekwini and in Tshwane, in Joburg and in Cape Town, the residential exclusion threshold is set above the average value for a government subsidized property, regardless of the age, above or below 8 years old. But in a number of the other cases, in most of the other metros, occupants of RDP houses, owners of RDP houses are being levied rates. So the conclusion then would be that the exclusion threshold is not very effective as a tool to give relief to RDP beneficiaries and owners of government subsidized properties. But is it succeeding in targeting the poor? So the first question we tried to think about was, well, what would be the monthly income level of homeowners who benefit from the residential exclusion threshold? So we did this very quick sort of back of the envelope analysis to say, okay, these are the 8 metros, these are the exclusion thresholds. If you had a property that was valued at this amount, then your estimated monthly bond payment would be about this, assuming that you're paying 30% of your monthly income on your bond and that you've accessed a bond with prevailing rates and typical terms without a FLISP. I haven't included that in this analysis. That would mean that your monthly household income was what's sitting here. So that calculation would suggest that in Joburg, homeowners with a monthly income of 23,000 or less are exempt from the exclusion threshold, due to the exclusion threshold. And that in Shwane and Ekurhuleni, they're exempting homeowners with monthly incomes of about 10,000 or less. So in terms of what this means about setting the residential exclusion threshold, there are a number of factors I think the metros need to consider. The first is around the collection rates. And although I think collection rates vary between about 80 and 95% or so, they would be much less this year, obviously. The collection rates will also vary, I would assume, by market segment. So the percent collected of properties that are valued between 2 and 3 million is likely very different than properties that are valued at 500,000 or less. So it would be important for metros to understand the different trends and averages by property value bands. The second key factor in setting the threshold would be thinking about the administrative costs that face low amount arrears. So the collection rate may be less at lower property value bands, but there's also an administrative cost that needs to be taken into account. The third factor would be the actual revenue foregone, and that's going to be a function of the actual rate in the Rand, the cent in the Rand rate, the collection rate for that market segment, and the number of properties and the value of the property. So all of these need to be taken into account. It is possible for the threshold to more accurately target owners of government houses if we take that data into account, if we look at the value of the RDP properties in the metro and think about that while we're setting the threshold. So for instance, you could utilize the record level data that metros have to determine what is the high, the low, and the medium value of RDP properties in the metro for, say, RDP properties that are over 8 years old. And then set the exclusion threshold at that median value. That would be a rational approach to achieve the policy objective to exempt most owners of RDP properties. So the data would allow us some simple modeling. We could then look at the potential impact on owners of government subsidized properties, the impact on poor households, and the potential revenue foregone. And in order to do that, the data we would need would be the collection rates by market value band, so the different bands of property values within the metros. We need to understand the high, low, and median value of RDP properties, which would again be possible with record level data from the metros. Also look at the number of RDP properties by market segment. So if you could know the number of RDP properties that are valued between 100,000 and 120,000, it would enable you to much more accurately pinpoint the exclusion threshold. And finally, the number of residential properties by thin market segments, as I said, using record level data. Now, if you took this kind of approach, it would allow that more accurate modeling would lead to a more rational and effective rates policy. And the importance of that is it then allows consistency between our human settlements, economic development, and poverty alleviation objectives, policy objectives we have, with the rates policy objectives. And it would more efficiently balance support for the poor with municipal financial sustainability as well. That's the end of the presentation, so I'll hand it back to you, Seth. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alison, for that thought-provoking presentation. A lot to chew and to digest. And I've already seen a number of questions on the chat. If there are any colleagues who would like to raise their hands and ask questions, we've got 5 minutes to entertain your questions. Can I see if there are any hands? Any questions?
Hi, Seth, Swiss Animals.
Yes, you can come. I suppose you were challenged. Your hand could not come up. Go ahead.
Yes, I've been battling to raise my hand.
I know. Sometimes it gets challenging. Go ahead, my brother.
Is it correct if I respond also to Keisha?
Yeah, you can also raise a question with Keisha. It's fine.
Okay. I would agree with her when it comes to, the issues of addressing affordability.
Sorry, colleagues, can you mute those that are not on the platform, please? Because I'm hearing a lot of noise in the background. Sorry, Vianney, for disturbing. Okay, go ahead.
So am I. Okay, let me carry on. Seth, I'm saying part of our strategy, to address what Keisha was alluding to in terms of access, affordability, and declining delivery. And I agree with her. Actually, our delivery ratio, if you look at the numbers, we came from 255,000, at our peak, and now we're sitting at 87,000. And last year it was 77,000 units per annum. So it's really going down. So what we need to do, you would have asked, what is the department strategy going forward, in terms of addressing all these challenges? So I can tell you comfortably that in terms of our policy instruments, we now trying to implement policy reforms, that are targeted at recalibrating our funding instruments and our implementation mechanism. As you know that we've already catalyzed FLISP, and we've increased subsidy quantums. We've also adjusted household income to enable access. And we've also ring-fenced, quite importantly, funding for FLISP. That's quite huge, because what it does now, you go to a financial institution and say, over the MTF period, this is how much we have, and how far can you go in terms of complementing that through debt funding. So that's important from our side. And we also, came up with numbers now over the MTSF period. We're saying 20,000 units. It's not enough. But remember now, budget will follow the demand. So instead of saying, okay, we're sitting down in our offices, we think this is what we should be delivering on, no, we're saying we're going where the demand is. And most importantly, we're now interfacing with GAS, Government Employee Housing Scheme, following our appointment of the implementing agency, which is NHFC now. And we've given them operational budget, and we're saying, let's interface now with Government Employee Housing Scheme. As you know, the scheme has to date delivered approximately 14,000 units, to the value of about 9.4 billion rand over a period of about just 5 years, because the scheme was introduced in 2015, 2016. But now let's go back to the issue of, full subsidy. We cannot go on to implement a full subsidy for every household. So through FLISP, now we are introducing a non-mortgage linked instrument, because people are saying, all you want is a service site, is a piece of stand, and we can build incrementally. And why don't government, provide us with funds towards building incrementally? And that's what we're looking at, just to set aside funding and to introduce implementation mechanism in terms of creating access to those households who cannot be able to raise mortgage finance, but are willing to build their houses if they are located, service sites. So that's what we're looking at as well. Our delivery vehicle, which is quite sound, is to deliver 30,000.
Can you move towards wrapping up the questions, Wisani? I'm just mindful of time. Yeah.
So no, I'm not asking a question. I'm just responding to the issues of access, affordability, yes, as well as spatial transformation. So I'm just alluding to the issue that the department is focusing on come the next 5 years. Just to wrap up, to say our sound vehicle now is social housing. We're delivering 30,000 units, and over a period of 5 years, obviously that would be about 4.2 billion rand. So that's what we are looking at, Seth, in terms of addressing these issues that Keisha was raising. And we agree with her that we need to come up with alternative strategies. Thank you.
Yes, so thank you for that input. I'm now tempted to move to the next presentation, which was supposed to start at 11:30. And I will now invite Anthea to be making that presentation. After Anthea's presentation, colleagues, I will try to make time to give space for some other questions and also for some final comments that will be coming, from our presenters as well. Okay, are you ready, Anthea?
Ready, Seth. I'm screen sharing. I just want to check that people can see the slides.
We can see. We can see. Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, colleagues, and thanks for this opportunity to present here. I can see, this is a very interesting discussion on the different layers of finance and financial financial inflow and outflow to municipalities in this time, and I think it's building up an interesting story and a set of issues. What I want to present on today, at the request of the organizers, is the preliminary findings of an analysis that we've been conducting with metros on the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown on the metro water business. This presentation came out of a request, or this analysis came from a request that came to CSP through a gathering of the metro water managers in late April, and we've commenced on this piece of work. We're still midway through it, which is why this is preliminary findings, and we'd be happy to come back and present if it's appropriate at a later stage when we've got deeper analysis on some of the work that we're looking to do, particularly on the informal settlement water and sanitation spend. I do just want to acknowledge the contributions and the kind of the analysis of both Neil McLeod and Rolf Eberhardt, who've been working with me and doing this work. I'm simply presenting their work here. They're working with the City Support Program on our water, support to the metros on water. Sorry, I just need to get to there. Right. So the City Support Program's support to metros on water started a couple of years ago. We worked with, and it came from the perspective of recognizing primarily the shocks that climate change was bringing to our water resources and our metros' ability to supply those water resources across South Africa. We've got a severe drought in the Eastern Cape. Cape Town has experienced a severe drought, as have many other municipalities across the country. And we wanted to look at how we support and how we work with the metros to build resilience to these kinds of shocks. What we found with the pandemic when it struck was that it too is an extremely sharp shock that offers a lens on the resilience of the city water business, and it's one that requires an absolutely immediate response for survival, obviously for citizens and the role of water in hygiene and sanitation practices, but also in terms of the finances and the financial viability of the city water business. Our work program, so we had work that started a couple of years ago. This was Cape Town in more depth, a shorter diagnostic with Nelson Mandela Bay. Our approach was to start this year with a diagnostic to the metros to identify what support we could offer. With COVID-19, our point of entry has been adapted to look at the impact and the shock that COVID provides to the metro water business. And in that, to that end, we have a 3-part diagnostic that's underway. We're partway through undertaking an analysis of the metro water budgets for the coming year. We are getting into an analysis of the sustainability and impact of these short-term water and sanitation interventions in informal settlements, and recognizing the criticality of service delivery and meeting the necessary levels of service delivery, whether we're in a pandemic or not. How metros financially manage the need to sustain these services and shift to longer term, more affordable services in informal settlements. And we're also conducting a more holistic view of the city water business. So I'll be presenting our initial and preliminary findings from an analysis of the metro water budgets, and in some cases this longer term view on the water business. What we recognized, and I think what is fairly well known, is that there has been declining performance, both operationally and financially, in municipalities in terms of their ability to deliver water services. This hits the headlines in very devastating accounts of service delivery failures across the country, in metros and beyond. And we've recognized that this baseline situation, together with COVID-19, creates the perfect storm. And what we've seen, and I think what we know through our analysis and what we've seen, is that our water businesses are not storm fit. Businesses are already in poor shape and are in decline, whether it's slow or rapid. And we see these water security issues across the country, whether it's drought induced or supply induced, exacerbated by operational failures. So, the proposition is that this combination is a perfect storm for the water business. I think it's a perfect storm for many other sectors of the country as well. And we're anticipating that metros will experience very acute cash shortages in their water business, which will affect their ability to pay suppliers and staff, as well as, and this will affect their ability to invest in their asset base, to maintain their infrastructure. And these effects are coming into play now. They're coming into play this year, and the impacts will be greater going forward. And I think it's just important to constantly reiterate that this comes on the base of an already weak system. There are calls, and there will be continued calls for bailouts to these businesses through different grants and cash injections. We recognize, I think, that in some cases, providing more money or further finance to these businesses where there are underlying operational, managerial factors affecting performance doesn't address the underlying causes. We're band-aiding the problem. So we recognize that the constraints to good performance are not technical or require additional finances, but the solutions lie in 4 other areas: political, structural, managerial, and regulatory. And the work that we want to take forward through National Treasury and the City Support Program is to look at the role that finance, the existing financial resources, can play in leveraging reforms. But this requires the support across the system, as well as an appetite to walk a journey of change to right the ship that is the faltering water business. So a couple of preliminary points is one is just to note, as I've said before, that this is very much work in progress, that we're dealing with quite significant value of assets, as well as the costs of inefficiencies are significant. So the effectiveness and efficiency of the city water business really matter. The estimated value of the assets that are at risk are significant, as you can see, and the cost of inefficient performance of money down the drain is similarly significant. We also recognize from the analysis that is done in different, or the analysis that is done or not done, in fact, in different parts of the system, is that there's a lot of data, there's a lot of numbers, there are a lot of figures out there, but we're not seeing an organization or a viewpoint that really analyzes this data and gives us a full and clear picture on the state of the metro water business, as well as the economics of the water business. So we're seeing, we're looking at the financials, but we're not looking at that over time, and we're not looking at what it means in terms of efficiencies, the ability to supply, to invest in assets, and so on. So there's a need to look at how we analyze our data and what we do with it. We want to put forward 4 propositions for our work and the work that will flow from this diagnostic that we're underway. And the first is that we know that the water business can and should be financially viable and sustainable. We know that it's necessary, in fact, for water businesses to be financially viable, and we need limited grants to support the basic service component, whether it's the basic service provision through the equitable share or the expansion of basic services to ensure that to ensure that access is met through capital grants. But the proposition is that outside of this aspect of basic services, that it is possible to fund the water business from the tariff and the sanitation business from either user charges or property taxes. The second proposition that we want to put forward is that we know what a well-run urban water business looks like, and we've had them, and it's achievable in South Africa. We've had water businesses that generate cash, they have the ability to borrow, they have good operational performance indicators in their non-revenue, they collect their cash, and they have the right sort of ratio of staff productivity in terms of numbers of staff per connection. And through benchmarkings, it's recognized that it is possible for performance to meet this, if not exceed it. So we know we have this experience of how to run a water business in the country. A third proposition that is being put forward is that the way that our system, our regulatory and legislative system has been set up in terms of engaging with the private sector is one where we are possibly locking ourselves into a situation of requiring that the municipality runs, the water and sanitation business is run through municipal departments, and that's the way to do it. What we're putting forward is that, in fact, internationally, for municipalities to run their own water business is rather an exception than the norm, and that it is possible for the establishment of publicly owned companies that are accountable, professionally managed, and able to take a longer term view to ensure the sustainability of the water business. We have our own recent and painful history and ongoing history in terms of what's happened with state-owned enterprises. So it's critical to tread and explore this terrain very carefully and cautiously in terms of what's proposed in the any legislative reform that might be needed. But it is a proposition to look at partnerships with the private sector for running an efficient water business. And then lastly, I think it's been spoken about before, is and Mari Jeng certainly mentioned it in her opening remarks, is the fact that in crises, there often lies opportunities for change. And what we're putting forward here is that the pandemic and the lockdown and what is happening to city water businesses is the catalytic event that could provide the space for reform of this business in South Africa. What we need in order to take that reform forward is the leadership at both a technical level as well as at a political level, to then walk a journey of change that requires building the capability, forging the alliances, and putting in place the institutional arrangements to take that change forward into, let's say, a new or an adapted way of running things. So this work is looking at what change can come through a situation where we are having the bottom brought up to meet us, I think, through the pandemic. So then, just to go into the water budget analysis, we've done the analysis for 4 metros, for 2 Gauteng metros, for Nelson Mandela Bay and Mangaung. I've been told that Buffalo is close to being completed, and we've got analyses that are underway the other 3 metros. So I'm going to present on firstly an initial set of trends that are coming from this work at a high level, and then to go into so trends over time, and then to look at what we're seeing in the 2021 budget analysis. Just to say also that, well, this analysis has been presented at the Metro benchmarking engagements that concluded last week with Mangaung. So what I'm presenting here has been presented to the metros and accepted by the metros. So the analysis of Johannesburg, noted looking back over a decade plus, that the city was in a financial crisis, and the water business specifically was in a financial crisis in the early 2000s. A management contract was instituted, and that management contract brought about significant improvements in the financial performance of the business as well as operational performance. For about a decade, the city has lived off the legacy of that turnaround and has been able to maintain good performance, both financially and operationally, over time. But we're starting to see in the analysis that operational performance is starting to decline. There's non-revenue water is growing. There is declining cash collection. And as a result, the city is having to make increasing provision for bad debt. So what we have in Johannesburg, a success story, but we're starting to see the erosion of management autonomy in the system, and that's starting to filter through into the financial and operational performance. In the city of Tshwane, interestingly, what we've seen is and remains largely good financial performance. But I think, as anybody who reads the news knows, that there has been significant decline in operational performance. There are some questions around the validity or the completeness of the financial information in terms of the extent to which the overheads of the water business are factored into the finances, as well as the extent to which sufficient provisions are made for debt impairment and depreciation. The city's own self-assessment shows that it doesn't have an adequate staffing component to deliver the services sufficiently, that it doesn't have the right skills. The city's own self-assessment shows that it doesn't have a robust plan for repairs and maintenance in place, and that is not investing sufficiently in repairs and maintenance. What we have seen is significantly growing non-revenue water, as well as since 2013, an absolute drop-off in the city's capital expenditure in the water business. So these 2 metros do show, strong-ish financial performance, but between the 2, differing declines in operational performance. And this is going back over a number of years. In Nelson Mandela Bay, the metro shows an operating surplus, but it's argued that, and agreed by the metro, that this is not a true reflection of the full costs of the business. It's not accounting for its municipal overheads. There have been absolute escalating service charges in the business, as well as a declining cash collection. This declining cash collection has required that the metro set aside further from their budget for bad debt provision. But they're not setting aside enough for bad debt provision because the customer debts are increasing. The metro also has rising employee costs and severely high non-revenue water. Their capital expenditure is also grant dependent, so it's not running a viable business. And Mangaung's story is,
we left with about plus minus 5 minutes now to wrap up.
Sure, I will. Thanks, Seth, for the prompt. Mangaung's story is one that the metro business is in distress and unsustainable. It has an operating deficit. Its debt impairments are significant. There are extremely high levels of non-payment. Debt is growing, so the debt impairments are not sufficient, and the debtors' days are far beyond the benchmark. Mangaung is also unable to pay its supplier, so its business is far from being a going concern. The non-revenue water is also high, and the cash collection is drastically low. So this trend analysis of the 4 metros show a business in these 4 metros that is what one would argue is not sustainable, and certainly increasingly inefficient. We're seeing the sort of headline findings across all are declining cash collection rates. This is requiring increasing provision for bad debt. However, as we saw in Mangaung and Nelson Mandela Bay, increasing customer debts. Metros are not setting aside sufficient funds for depreciation, and there is not sufficient investment in repairs and maintenance. We see that the businesses are not accounting for full costs, and they're not ring-fenced. Declining financial performance in some, as I mentioned, from Joburg and Tshwane, but starting to show, and in other cases, firmly declining operational performance. We know our non-revenue is growing, and this is prior to the impact of COVID-19 and the lockdown. So when we dive, a couple more slides, when we dive into the 2021 budgets, looking at the revenue and the cash budgets, we're saying that from what we've seen in the budget analysis, from the benchmarking engagements, the revenue forecasts, the Metro's expected revenue going forward are optimistic, recognizing the economic impacts of the lockdown. Provisions for bad debt have been increased, but we're saying that these are not sufficient, and the cash flow forecasts are optimistic given what state the economy is in and the ability to pay. So we're saying that the revised revenue budgets are overly optimistic. They were overly optimistic for 1920, and they provide a poor base for the budget going forward. So the overall conclusion looking at the revenue side is the Metro water budgets do not match the economic reality that the country is in, and these need to be adjusted. We're seeing in these are the increase in service charges. So metros are increasing the service charges between about 7 and 19% in the case of Mangaung. So significant increases in service charges, and the cash collection rates, they're expected to have improved cash collection rates in 2021 compared to the prior year. The numbers for Mangaung are an anomaly, so please don't consider those. The numbers didn't add up. So it's off the back of what was reported for the 1920 period, and the expected increases for 2021 being greater despite the economic context that we're in. Looking at the expenditure side, we've seen, aside from Nelson Mandela Bay, staff increases have been budgeted, staff cost increases have been budgeted as if there's no recession. We're seeing inadequate provisions for bad debt, for depreciation, as well as for bad debt. And as we will delve into in a separate analysis, significant increases in contracted costs, which reflect the costs of the short-term interventions in informal settlements largely, but noting that these costs are expensive and not sustainable. So in terms of righting the ship, as we go back to the propositions that we've put forward, we recognize that the urban water business does not need to be in the state that we're seeing. What we do need to right the ship is governance and leadership that does the right thing in terms of creating the autonomy, sending the right signals, and creating an enabling environment for the business. We need a professional cadre of management in the metro water businesses who have the skills and experience, the technical know-how, and a skilled workforce that doesn't rely on the contracted services that some metros do. We need a supportive and enabling procurement regime that guards against corruption, but similarly enables efficiencies, effective regulation, and sufficient access to a combination of commercial and grant finance is argued for. I won't go through this slide in detail.
Wrap up now. Yes, I'm sorry about that.
The proposition here is that we've put forward is, to what extent is there the possibility to use financing as an incentive for reforms, to use the existing financing as an incentive for reforms, to then work with metros for a bottom-up example of what's possible to reform the urban water business. So we've been engaging the metros, and we're starting to sense appetite from a number of metros to walk a journey of change. What we need for this work is a kind of alignment or support at a top management level between management and mayor for this work going forward. And then the work that can be rolled out and that we're looking to partner with to roll out with the metros is a range of, whether it's small interventions to enhance the technical capability, whether it's a deeper set of interventions to address some of the operational and performance challenges that the metros face. But we also recognize that there's a need for a complementary and aligned set of reforms and engagements that need to take place in the regulatory sphere. So this is the package of work that we're putting forward and looking to roll out. Where we're going with this is to complete the analyses. We're going to be convening next week the metro water managers to engage on these diagnostics, to look at exploring what solutions are possible to take these interventions forward, and then to continue the engagement with national stakeholders, and then to engage metros substantively in terms of what support is needed and what requests for support come in from metros to walk this journey of change to right that tilting ship that is the metro water business. So I'll leave it there. Thank you, Seth.
So much. Good food for thought, and your next steps are clearly, are stipulated, and so we know exactly where you are going. And so I just hope the metros have taken note of the next steps. Colleagues, we've noted all your questions that were on the chat, and I've also noted that there has also been some response and some also suggestions that there would be also offline conversation, which is very, constructive as a progress. If there are any key or burning, questions that people would like to, to raise, I will give the next 2 to 3 minutes, that opportunity, for those questions that people would like to raise. After that, Keisha will be coming in just to wrap today's session, and then we close off on that note. Thank you. Any pressing or burning questions that could not be accommodated on the chat, just proceed, go ahead, if you cannot raise the hand. Okay, it does not look there is a question or a comment. Keisha, shall we then move now to the wrap up of the entire session? What are the key issues that are emerging? And after that, I would also like just maybe some few comments from the platform as to how they would like the next COP being conducted. What topic would they like to suggest in terms of housing finance? It would be helpful for us so that at least we are guided, by your thoughts as well. You can also put your thoughts on the chat as well. Thank you. Keisha?
Thanks very much, Seth, and thank you, everybody. The chat conversation was sort of happening on the side, and a lot of detail and very interesting insights there. I think this has been a great session and some really interesting inputs from everybody. And what it all, for me, the thing that ties it all together really is and which is the point of these community of practice sessions around property markets and housing markets, is how the property market itself can support and enable the municipality to apply a series of levers other than the subsidy instrument to be able to achieve its responsibilities within the local neighborhood. We haven't had enough time for questions and for a discussion around the questions. We're going to take all of the ones in the chat, and I'd like to say that we're also open to receive them by email. Questions to Anthea, questions to Alison and James, questions to me, all of us. And and so that we can talk about these issues further. I think there are some areas we're all hungry for thinking more deeply. I'd like to investigate a little bit more the rates policies and how that relates to property markets. Andre raised that also as a point on the chat. But Seth, I'm mindful of time. I'm going to leave it there. Perhaps just open it for anyone to comment on what they would like to see at the next community of practice, and if they have also any thoughts about how to carry these ideas further as well.
Okay, Wisani, are you saying something?
Yes, thanks, Seth. I just sent you a note. I was saying this is quite, fruitful, and I would like more time, to be dedicated to discussions, comments, and questions. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, colleagues, that we underestimated the time and we did not give enough time for discussions and questions. It defeats the purpose of a committee of practice, because it's supposed to be doing that instead of just, the presentation. We'll get that right next time. We've noted it. Any other view or question or comment?
Yes, Seth, I just wanted to sort of reiterate what Kezia was saying. There's a lot of rich data that's underneath both my presentation and Kezia's. And if metros are interested in unpacking it further, please contact us. We're happy to walk you through the dashboards, to crunch further numbers, ask questions of the data that you're interested in learning. We will be, over the next 2 or 3 months, producing individual metro reports for each of the 8 metros, and producing those on our website and also sharing those with you. So those will be sort of 8 to 10 page write-ups of what the data says about your particular metro. But we'd like to shape the analysis in those reports according to what you're interested in. So by all means, please contact either me or Kezia and say, can the data tell us about this? Can you look into this? And we'll try to shape the reports in a way that is particularly useful, and also show you how to use the dashboards to start to answer those questions and explore them.
Okay, the offer is noted, but I would recommend that we try to coordinate that support. It could be done, via the CSP, just to make sure that we do not leave other metros outside of the, of the process. And so, as I indicated earlier on, that we really want to see greater understanding of this data, by the metros. And also basically, for the metros to be able to start to be owning, to be playing with this data, which is going to be very helpful to you in terms of your planning, for human settlements and just for development, in the metro in general. On that note, colleagues, I would like to declare this meeting closed, and also would like to say thank you, and thank you very much to all the presenters, Kezia, Alison, James, as well as Anthea. You've given us a lot of food, for thought. And also very thanks to our participants as well who attended today's COP. As indicated earlier on, we will be distributing this presentation to you, and you can also basically get and access this presentation from CAHF web, resource. And so thank you very much. The meeting is now declared closed. Bye-bye.